Is imagination simply contained in the mind, or does it tap into an unseen world with messages waiting to be told? There is a place where legends cross over into our world, where strange visions and whispers beckon, and superstition takes hold. Step into the Black Cat's shadow.
This is Burkittsville, formerly Blair. It is a small, quiet Maryland town, much like a small, quiet town anywhere. No more than 20 families laid their roots here over 200 years ago, many of whom remain, either on this hill or in the town below. There are an unusually high number of children laid to rest here, most of whom passed in the 1940s. Yet no one in the town seems to recall anything unusual about this time. To us, anyway. Yet legend tells a different story. One whose evidence is all around us. Etched in stone. Yeehaw! Well, we have shot the first scene, the cemetery scene. The opening is shot. We're doing a documentary about the Blair Witch. Oh, have you heard of the Blair Witch?
Oh, yeah. That's an old story. I remember.
Welcome back to the Black Cat Shadow. I'm one of your hosts, Andy, podcasting from Kansas City, Missouri.
And I'm Phantom Dark Dave, coming at you from the heart of Texas. With us today, a man who took us deep inside the Black Hills Forest. His vision brought us the terrifying tale of 3 film students who set out to make a documentary, but quickly discovered that sometimes it's better to just stay home. Please welcome to the show the man who brought us the film that scared our pants off, the writer and director of the 1999 film The Blair Witch Project, Mr. Dan Myrick. Dan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, guys.
So we always like to hear like the beginning, our guests, how they got started in their field. When did you first decide, hey, I want to be a writer?
It's kind of weird because when I was around 13, my mom bought me a camera, a small little DSLR camera. And I had always liked to draw and do visual arts sort of thing. So I got this camera and went out, took pictures and started learning sort of the visual, storytelling sense. And then shortly after that is when video was sort of kind of coming into its own. So I got a video camera and I realized that, hey, man, there's actually, you can tell stories with this, and there's people that make a living doing this. And then my Aunt Pat bought me this book called Movie Magic, which was all the behind the scenes of some of my favorite films like King Kong and, all the Godzilla flicks. I love to watch those. And so that just showed me how the inner workings of the film process was done. And I was sort of hooked from there. And I just knew, like, fairly early on, that's what I wanted to aspire to do.
Basically, you've been one to make movies from the very beginning. Then you didn't start writing and then decide to make movies. You've always wanted to make movies. Yeah,
I mean, I dabbled a little bit in music. I was in a band for a little while, a really bad one, and thought that, well, maybe I'll be a rock star, but really that fell by the wayside real quick. But yeah, I was just always sort of fascinated by how movies have an effect on you, so like emotionally and intellectually. And there was a big turning point for me after seeing Close Encounters of the Third Kind, because I was always a sci-fi buff, and seeing that film sort of portraying aliens as friendly was just like earth-shattering for me. And I just remember coming out of the theater saying, I just want to make people feel this way. I want to make people feel the way I felt coming out of that movie.
That is a special gift to be able to have that kind of talent, to be able to bring out emotions in people. That's definitely a special thing to be able to do.
Talking about some of the older sci-fi films, I just wanted to touch base on that. Did you have any particular favorite monster movies? I know you talked about King Kong and you talked about Godzilla. Did you ever see anything or inspired by films like It Came from Outer Space or It Came from Beneath the Sea, any of those old movies?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have this really cheesy set of sci-fi classics, which I mean, I watch at least one of these a week, from like the Astral Factor and the Alpha Incident and Kong Island, and all those are great. And but yeah, I mean, I'm a kind of a robot collector, and I grew up on Robbie the Robot and Forbidden Planet and those, and I just there was just something. They always had this sort of kind of social commentary laced underneath sort of the cheesiness, about mankind and how we treat the environment, and how we treat each other. And I just loved that about it. And they were always very optimistic as well with regards to technology. And it's just, it was just that time of space exploration, the Apollo program, and we were just sort of like leading the charge with regards to science fiction. And I grew up in that era. It was just a lot of fun, and I have a big nostalgia for it today.
Yeah, I found it so interesting because you've pretty much named my entire VHS collection that I have back here. I collect all the vintage because I'm a big fan of box art as well.
Oh yeah.
And I was showing Andy this huge VHS collection, and literally you've named every movie in there. I have a lot more, but have you seen the Monolith Monsters by chance?
No, I have not. I
highly recommend it. Yeah, Monolith Monsters.
Awesome.
But getting a little more into the horror aspect of things, I wanted to know, where did you guys come up with the initial backstory for the witch on this?
Well, it sort of grew organically. I mean, we originally came up with this kind of notion, and really it was just a scene. Ed and I were talking about in film school about how creepy it would be to sort of be in the woods and imagine you've got a camera in your hand and you're walking through the woods and you come upon this old house, and how creepy it would be just to be walking up to this old house to see what's inside of it. There's just something inherently foreboding about that. And so sort of based on that scene, we sort of backwards engineered, well, who would be walking up there, and what's the premise behind it all, and da 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 da. And as time went on, we sort of settled on it being filmmakers. Originally, it was like an expedition, but they were filming what they were doing, and then it became filmmakers. But and then the base story was, well, what are they out there filming? Why are they out there with cameras? So we had to create this mythology, this backstory or folklore as a project that they were out shooting. And so we loosely based it on a lot of kind of, regional folklore, because that area where we shot in Maryland has a lot of Civil War stories and Indian folklore and Salem witch trials and all that stuff. So we sort of pulled part and parcel from a lot of these different kind of stories of that kind of region and made our own mythology. And it started out very simply. It's just sort of an excuse to get the kids out there. And as people got more and more involved online and asking questions, it forced us to really think through more in detail about what went down out in those woods, and came up with all those kind of earlier episodic stories of Eileen Treacle and Rustin Parr and all this kind of reoccurring events that took place out there, inspired a lot by Devil's Triangle and Bigfoot and that sort of thing.
So you guys always had it in your mind to do found footage, or was that something that came along after you got started with it, the project?
Well, it was pretty much going to be a mockumentary, pseudo documentary, if you will. One of the shows that we both Ed and I really were inspired by was a show called In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, and that we always felt that was super creepy, and it was sort of a cross between narrative storytelling and documentary coverage, and we wanted to have sort of that feeling that it's authentic, that it's not scripted necessarily. Another film that came out roughly around that time was Legend of Boggy Creek. So there was a few films that were sort of playing with that genre. We just wanted to take it like another step farther and really kind of make it from a first person perspective. The actual found footage component being from the victims themselves was sort of a new take on it. But that sort of format, that aesthetic, was sort of borrowed from those earlier shows and movies.
Yeah, and I think that, I know for me personally, like I never even, like, before I saw Blair Witch Project, I'd never even heard of like what they call now found footage, but it's like, oh yeah, somebody's taking a video camera with them and filming these odd things that are happening to them. Like, it was like a new thing, I think, for a lot of people that didn't grow up with In Search Of and some of those older TV shows like that. So yeah, I mean, got to give you credit for, kind of bringing that to the forefront and making it, now it's like its own subgenre of horror. You got people, they solely like review found footage movies, and so it's really built quite a cult following, from your idea there. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of phenomenon to see take place. I think a lot of it is we were sort of products of our time. When we were starting to do Blair Witch, video was just sort of coming into its own. MTV had just started The Real World. They had the first kind of season of Real World. And of course, CNN and news channels were going 24/7 with their coverage, and they were having to kind of create narratives, to fill content. And so the public was becoming more sensitized to the found footage style, things being told with shaky handheld cameras. And so it wasn't a big leap for them to sort of like appreciate and embrace something shot as a feature film in the movie theater that way. Even though we sort of popularized that, we were sort of a product of the age, a product of the technology. And if we hadn't done it, someone else would have. But now, I mean, everyone's carrying cameras and cell phone video, and it's almost impossible to shoot a movie without at least some of that content in it, because it's just such a part of our everyday lives to have video posted on Facebook and, selfies and whatnot. It's just that media is a real component of everyone's kind of ongoing narratives.
One thing that I had read was that the entire film was shot in just 8 days, and that's just so impressive to me, because you read about some movies taking months or even years to actually just film, much less to edit. And I read that the editing process was even longer than that. And so I guess my question for you comes down to, what are some of the biggest things that you guys ran into, since you got the whole thing wrapped up in 8 days filmed, but then the editing process took a long time. I had read that you had to cut a lot of the movie out. So what were some of the things that maybe we didn't get to see?
Well, there was, our original plan was to, shoot it more like a traditional documentary, where the found footage portion of the movie would only comprise maybe 20 or 30 minutes of the finished film. And then we'd have a whole bunch of like talking heads and interviews with experts and pan and scans of maps and all the, Ken Burns kind of stuff that you would see. And that was sort of the original concept. And so when we went out to the woods for the 8 days, we knew we wanted to shoot it in real time, basically. It did take about a month of prep, because we had to like map out all the areas in the woods, set up the gags. We had GPS, which enabled the actors to sort of navigate unassisted by us. And so there was a lot of logistics involved with setting up those 8 days, but we wanted the 8 days to be as much real time and in character as possible, so that we'd have a lot of really authentic looking stuff. But then, once we got back to the edit, we had a whole bunch of raw footage, and then we shot all that kind of what we call the phase 2 stuff, which was the talking head stuff and backstory and whatnot, which ultimately ended up on the Sci-Fi special. But the reason why the edit took so long is that we just had so much raw material, and we, very much like a normal documentary, you have to kind of pull the narrative out of all that raw material. And so much of the direction took place in the post process, and decision making took place in the post process, like a typical documentary. And that was sort of by design. And the actual production shoot went real quick. But then you have all this material that is not, scripted necessarily, that you're having to make work, and that's what takes so much time, because at the time we don't know what's scary or not. We're so close to the material. There's just a lot of trial and error, and even we're kind of victims of our own process. We may see a scene that we think is really awesome, but it comes across a little bit contrived, and it doesn't strike that kind of authenticity we're looking for. So we had to do a lot of test screenings, internal screenings, to make sure Ed and I weren't too close to the material. And that takes time. That just takes a lot of time.
And you talked about, keeping that level of authenticity, and you actually had some unscripted things that you would do to the actors that would genuinely scare them. Tell us about a few of those things.
Well, the actors pretty much knew we were going to mess with them every night. They didn't know exactly what we were going to do, and some nights were a bit more free form than others. Like the first night they were out there camping, it was just a few cracks in the woods, and they were instructed to kind of exit the tent, shoot everything, and just sort of react. And then as time moved on, we wanted to kind of continue turning the screws on them. So each night got progressively worse. And by the time we got to this night where the kids are outside, you hear the kids' voices and the tent's shaking, that was a pretty, orchestrated reaction from them, believe it or not. We had to kind of tell them that we have a marked path for them to exit so they wouldn't run into a tree, because it was total darkness out there. So they wouldn't run into something and hurt themselves. So they knew they were instructed to follow this path to run, and then kind of hunker down in the grass after they ran out. And again, roll camera on everything. There was a beat where Heather was instructed to kind of react to this so-called ghost we had in the trees as she was running, which is where she says, "Well, what the fuck is that? What the fuck is that?" Which ultimately didn't read on camera, but. So that was fairly orchestrated, that setup. And then ultimately at the house, that was done over a couple of days, over numerous takes, to make it all look like one single take, because it was so logistically complex. So although some of the reactions are genuine, they're genuine surprise and kind of authentic reactions, I don't think they were ever really scared. That's all just acting ability. They were just able to really get into that place in their minds to have real authentic reactions. But so it was a blend of us surprising them and them getting into character for what we needed for the scene. So it ended up working out really well. But it was a complicated shoot, and we were always waiting for someone to get their eye poked out or something while they're running through the woods that would have ended everything, or maybe we would have found a way to script it in. I don't know, but that was always, we were always waiting for that shoe to drop.
Yeah, I mean, and and I also heard that you guys kind of, like you talked about turning the screws on the actors, and you guys would kind of do some things that kind of to cause them to like bicker more and fight more amongst themselves. And it was like, I forgot what were some of the things that you did for that.
Well, I mean, you're part of the reality is when we were casting the movie, it was Greg Hale, who was our producer, sort of made up this casting notice, which has become pretty famous now, about, your safety is our primary concern, but your comfort is not. So the actors that are signing up knew they were going to be out camping for 8 or 9 days, and they're going to be, pissing in the woods, and it's not going to be a comfortable, where you've got a trailer that you can, after the wrap of the day, you can go chill out in your trailer and come back the next morning refreshed. It wasn't one of those kinds of movies. So they knew it was going to be stressful, like, sort of a hardcore camping experience for 8 days. And that in and of itself just makes you sort of irritable. You're not getting a lot of sleep. It's wet, it's cold, it's in October in Maryland. You're stuffed in a small tent with 2 other people you don't know. And so and at the same time, the filmmakers are slowly ramping back your rations. You're not getting 3 hot meals a day. Towards the end, you're just getting power bars and water, and so you're hungry, you're tired, and that helped to sort of elevate their performance and make everybody just sort of irritable and cranky. And that's what you want. That's exactly what would have happened in real life. So they just sort of took those cues and those triggers, if you will, and worked with them and played them up. And if there were any adjustments to be made, like one of the big reasons why we elected to pull Josh out of the field, because originally it was scripted for Mike to come out of the field. Just personality wise, Josh and Heather were arguing a lot from the get-go, and they had a lot of, arguments throughout the production, and those are the choices they were making. So we felt if we had pulled Mike out halfway through the movie, then it would have just been more arguing to the end. So we decided to switch that up and pull Josh out based on our observations of their performances throughout the production, and leave Mike then to sort of take over and be forced to work with Heather for the last, the third act. So that's an example of changing our plan based on performance and their arguing and their reactions and whatnot, and being flexible to do that.
Yeah, I felt like it worked really well for the story. You can't tell what's being changed and what's not being changed, but overall, I mean, just from a viewer at the time, I thought the movie was magnificent, and it was extremely visual for, what you do get to see, like the stickmen figures, because those things, they were idolized forever. I remember going to the movie theater and seeing different films at the time where this was out, because I hadn't truly discovered my love for horror just yet. And those figures would be like in the creek by the theater. And
right.
There was huge phenomena. Craze was going. It's like, is it real? Is it not real? Who knows? But the idea is that people love this movie and they're replicating it. And, speaking of that, I was going to ask you, you talked about in film school, you had the vision of what, they're creeping through the woods and they see this old house. You managed to replicate your vision of that old house. Was that a house you guys had to have built for it, or did you just find the right house that matched for, what you were visioning?
We found the house. Matt Compton was helping us with locations in the area, and it was a house that was next to a I believe it's an Air Force base or Army base, and it was abandoned. I mean, it was just an old, probably Civil War era house or something, or maybe not quite that old. And then Ben Rock, who was our production designer, our small little crew went out there, and he had to get rid of a lot of the graffiti that was painted inside because it had to look period. So we got rid of a lot of that and cleared out a path so the actors could come up and down and go down in the basement and whatnot. So there's a lot of work to prep the house, but the house itself was there, and that was our only real company move we had to do because it was in a different park. So we had to shoot the final film the last couple of days at that park with the house. And it was just, out of sheer luck, we found that house. It was awesome.
Sounds like one of those things that's too good to pass up, really.
Yeah. I mean, and we had access to it, and, again, we were too stupid to know any better about getting permits or any of that stuff. But we wanted to make sure it was safe and that you could go up the stairs and whatnot. So it was structurally sound. And the challenge, of course, was to do the scene where the actors just come upon this house and discover it, and then they follow our path through the house up to the third floor, back down into the basement, and all that gets choreographed out the right way, which, like I said before, we had to do over the course of a couple of days. But the original, that opening shot where they emerge from the woods and see that house for the first time is them actually seeing it for the first time. We transferred their camp in the woods out of eye shot of the house, and they didn't know the house was there. Had them camp up, and then we woke them up, and then we said, just walk in this direction and then react to what you see, and they see this house. And that's an honest reaction to that house when they see it.
Another reason why it sounded so perfect, I guess.
Yeah.
At any point in time when filming this, did you guys consider the idea of trying to show more in the film? Because, a lot of times people forget sometimes it's what you don't see that could be more scarier. I talk on radio. I can't even say it right. It could be scarier. But, at any point were you guys considering of showing more hints of the Blair Witch, or was it always figured out that you were just going to hint at it but never show it?
Well, part of it was just budget. We didn't really have the money to do anything that would blow anybody away as far as, CGI or costumes or what have you. But really, I think our mandate from the very beginning was rooted in what we felt made things like In Search Of and UFO, photos and stuff so scary. Is what you don't see. It's like they're always like grainy photos. Inconclusive, blurry images and whatnot. And that just is what makes them so scary. I mean, if you saw this perfectly rendered alien standing in someone's backyard, you're like, oh, it's kind of fake. Even if it was real, it's that blurry nighttime glow between the trees that your imagination starts taking over. And so we were wanting to strike a balance between that. And the toughest part for Ed and I was the ending, because we knew we needed a big payoff for the audience. We didn't want to lead them through this whole exploration and then have nothing of consequence at the end for a payoff. But we also knew we didn't want the witch coming out of the woods and I'm the witch and having a real cheesy ending, which would completely undermine the whole point of the documentary. So it took us a while. I mean, it was up until like 3 days before we started shooting, before we finally came up with an ending of Mike standing in the corner and Heather being just hit at the end, and the camera runs out of film. That was the balance that we struck. But we had ideas of several different alternate endings that were ultimately shot when artists had picked up the movie. But originally, we came up with that standing in the corner as just the right balance between payoff and one of those what the fuck moments at the end, but not seeing the alien in the suit.
Yeah, and while this movie, you had it largely improvised as far as like the dialogue stuff, but you did have kind of a framework in place. You had like specific roles for each character, right? I mean, you had like kind of like, I don't know what you call it, archetypes that you wanted a function that you wanted each character to perform within the movie.
Absolutely, yeah. It was very well scripted out. We had about a 38-page script where everyone had specific roles. Every beat in the movie was kind of pre-planned. Not every beat, but most every beat. But all the tentpole moments were all premeditated, and we wanted it to have its own narrative arc. The film students go out into the woods. They're all yucking it up. They're having a great time. They're not taking it really seriously. And as things start to progress, everything from the visuals, where we desaturated the visuals over time, to the sound as we're slowly pulling ambient sound out, making it more austere in the sound design, to the actors' performances. And we really were following an overall narrative script that was sort of laid down ahead of time, that were representing these big beats. For example, the meeting with Mary, where she gives us the horse lady story, was all scripted out, which is by intention was sort of laying this kind of mythological, creepy campfire story ahead of time in the audience's mind. So as our characters are going out in the woods, you've already got this little creepy story in your head. And, the cemetery, another beat where she's talking about what happened to the kids. So it's just subtle and intentional with our actors, where we scripted these things out. And a lot had to do with the casting as well. We wanted distinct personalities in the casting process, so they would come to full relief during production. So Heather was specific, Michael was specific, Josh was specific, all lending to this kind of premeditated narrative that we were hoping would come out during shooting, in which it did. But yeah, it was not random. by any measure. There was certainly a lot of thought going into the characters in the script and the performances as we were shooting.
Yeah, thinking about the characters, like I saw Heather as like a kind of she was very relentless in she was wanting to make this documentary and almost had like a Captain Ahab type quality to it, And yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, well, we were struggling a little bit because the original script had 3 guys in it, and we auditioned. I don't know, probably a couple thousand actors, between LA and New York and Orlando. Over the course of a year, we just saw tons of people, and we in New York we had to split it up. Ed was taking one audition room, I was taking one audition room, just so we could see more people. And they were just open casting calls. And Heather came into my room first, and one of the things Ed and I were struggling with early on is like, what we have to answer in the movie is why the camera would continue rolling. It's one of my biggest complaints with found footage films that get it wrong is they're in dire circumstances, yet the camera's still rolling, or there's some really intimate moment between 2 people and someone's there filming. It's like, well, why aren't they looking at the guy with the camera and say, hey, shut that damn thing off? There has to be a reason why the camera is continuing to roll. And we have to have an explanation as to why. So we needed a personality that was a little bit like kind of crazy, kind of narcissistic, kind of driven, and needed to be powerful enough to get these 2 guys to go along with them. And Heather came in and portrayed that perfectly. And so it's kind of viable while she's so driven and insecure, she won't give up the fact that she doesn't really know what she's doing. So you needed to believe that she would continue rolling. And then over time, it suddenly transitions into sort of like a survival film where now it's just, well, we have to just continue recording because, people may find this video and not know where our bodies are kind of thing. So it was a tricky balance to have an excuse to continue rolling camera, and you needed the right personality behind camera to justify it. And that was one of the things that we had to kind of figure out early on.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I also heard about there was an idea to have a plot twist. I thought this was interesting. There was an idea to have a plot twist involving the 2 fishermen that they run into, like towards the beginning of the movie. The fishermen that kind of tell them the story about some of the history, the folklore. Tell us a little bit about that plot twist you guys were thinking about.
Well, I mean, there's so many, but that they were going to. It was kind of them up to no good. There's actually in there because they describe a little bit of the Eileen Treacle story there, which is a great scene with those 2 guys, and so yeah, that they were kind of messing with the kids out in the woods. We had another plot twist we entertained for about 10 minutes that Josh was behind it all, that he disappeared. He was the one actually messing with. He had planned it all by design, and he ultimately was responsible for the disappearance. So there was a lot of different plot twists that we toyed with, a lot that the audience, the fan base came up with, which we thought were cool. But ultimately we stuck with sort of the straight and narrow, where we tried to strike a balance between, could it have been supernatural or could it have been rednecks messing with them in the woods? We didn't want to tip the scale too much into any one area. So there would be that debate afterwards where you could say, I just think somebody like those fishermen were messing with them, or it was Josh, or, we had lots of speculation about what actually happened. And then there's those that like, no, there's definitely something going on in those woods. That's like witchcraft going on right there, which is cool as well. So we just left it open, and that ambiguity is what ultimately worked for us. And that's a hard thing to trust because most studios and all don't like ambiguity at all, and they need answers, and they need it all wrapped up at the end. And we just sort of ran with it and just trusted that the audience would pick up on it and embrace it. And fortunately they did.
I know for me, one thing that I really appreciated was we already talked about how great the actors were, but the three of them, you guys didn't write or change the script to make it any kind of like Pearl Harbor-ish type, third wheel, guy and girl together, and then there's a side wheel. I like how, each one stood for themselves, and you never knew who was going to turn on who, because I felt like, I had read that there had been maybe an idea of maybe Heather and, either Joshua or Mike maybe having a relationship, and I felt like that would have kind of took the film in a different direction, and I think you guys made the right decision. I'm not one to judge, but I just, as a viewer and somebody who really loves the film, I feel like you guys made all the right decisions in the script to really bring forth the personalities and to really give kind of the best performances that there could have been.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think a lot of it is just for us, and it's easier said than done. But, back in those days, we didn't really, we weren't burdened with having to make a movie to fit in any particular mode or model or construct. We were just basically driven by what we felt was authentic. That was our underlying mandate with the whole movie, is that every moment had to feel authentic and real. And if anything felt contrived, like there was this love scene between Josh and Heather, I mean, they didn't obviously have any chemistry in that regard with each other. It would have been forced. It would have felt fake. And in reality, it's a survival movie. It's the last thing you want to do is think about hooking up when you're trying to get the hell out of the woods, right? So we embraced it for what it was, and its very pure kind of primal essence of three people lost in the woods. It's getting dark. We need to get the hell out. And that has more drama than you'll ever need. You don't need to add to that. You just embrace that authenticity and work with that and make your movie around that. Anything else will feel contrived. And that's, I think, what a lot of Hollywood films fall into, that trap that, well, we've got to have such and such at this beat or at this page count or whatever. And they overthink it. They stop playing to the authenticity of the characters in the story, and they start interjecting things they feel will enhance it, when in reality it's taking away. And it's that minimalism and that authentic approach I try to bring to like all my films, but Blair Witch in particular was one of those in our point in our career that there was no reference point. It was just us sort of organically making it up as we went along, and that was a real pure time. It was a lot of fun to be able to have that control and that freedom.
It wasn't talking about making other films. I know it wasn't too long after where a sequel had come out, and as far as credit, I know it's based off of characters that you guys came up with, but did you have a hand in that film whatsoever, or was it just character based?
No, it was, after the success of the first movie, it was just blowing up everywhere. And it was sort of going through the typical life cycle of a successful film, that once everyone has embraced it and loves it, then the press has to sort of like find what's wrong with it. So we're starting to feel this backlash of press saying it's overrated and this and that. And so we told artists, and it's probably best for us to chill out with the franchise for a couple of years, let the dust settle, and let's come back to this after it's had time to kind of settle for a while. And their logic was, well, no, we should strike while the fire's hot. And we want to do another movie right away, right on the heels of this one. And they were IPOing their company at the time, so they wanted this real high valuation and a bunch of business. And this was a crash course in Hollywood 101 for us dumb filmmakers. So we're like, well, we're not creatively really in that headspace. I mean, we can't just pop something out, in 6 weeks to go shoot. And so they hired Joe Berlinger, and he brought on a writer, and they did a draft, and we were like, gave notes in the first draft, and they didn't really take any of our notes. So we were just sort of like, well, it looks like you guys are going to do your movie your way. And we are just sort of going to be observers. And that's effectively what happened. They just went and did the film the way they wanted to do it. And, we gave them our blessing. We got executive producer credit on it, and said, we hope for the best. But our biggest complaint at the time was that they were just breaking the mythology. They were sort of made a movie that was self-referential of the first film. We just thought that wasn't the way to go for us. It wouldn't, you've got so much mythology to mine that we created. You could have been a Rustin Parr movie, or an origin story about L.A. Kedward would have been awesome. I mean, look at the success of Witch. I mean, we could have done a really cool period piece with L.A. Kedward's story and something like that. But they just didn't want to go there. They wanted to do something that was talking about the success of the first movie. And, the film itself is not a terrible film. And I think in its own right, did pretty well as far as a low budget indie movie goes. But because it was tethered to the first film, which was such a phenomena at the time, it got probably bashed more than it should have. But that's just Hollywood. They just do things on their own timelines and in their own way. And sadly, the very people that create these golden eggs for these folks, they end up kicking out of the house and go do it themselves. It's like, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's unfortunately the way the business is run. But I have no real complaints. It's just the second film was sort of done without our input, and it is what it is.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, like, I remember when it came out, I enjoyed it. But what I enjoyed the most about the film was, like you said, the mythology that kind of snuck in there. Because, after this movie came out, I went on some sort of fascination. And this episode's not about me, but I have to say, I dove into what Burkittsville was, the inspiration, the witch, the Rustin Parr who confesses to the murders. Like, I was all into that stuff, and I thought it was fascinating. And hearing you talk about all these what if scenarios gives me chills, and make a Rustin Parr movie. Let's go. I want to see that,
Awesome. I just think it's a no brainer, man. And like, I even like to do it like in black and white noir or something, it's like totally, let's just go crazy. But yeah, I mean, there's an Eileen Treacle story, and of course, Rustin Parr, and Ed and I even wrote a script, a sequel script. That's a whole new story, a whole new episode out there that, is it more of a traditional narrative, but it all plays on the original conceit that there is this place in the Black Hills of Maryland that's legit. It's something that one could even speculate that goes even before the L.A. Kedward incident. That's just the first recorded incident. It could go back into Native American folklore even. So there's a lot you could play around with because it's all made up. There's no rules. So we're just not quite sure why the powers that be haven't embraced that very rich mythology we've laid out on a silver platter for them. They just haven't wanted to explore any of that stuff. And they keep wanting to make something outside of that, outside of those episodes, outside of those mythologies. And so we're still sort of waiting in the wing until they want to come back around.
Well, I'll just let you know, Black Cat Shadow podcast here, we donate to films we want to see made. So if that ever comes up on the table, put the word out.
Awesome. That sounds great, man.
So Daniel, we want to give you a chance to talk about maybe some of your other work that may be under the radar that people should check out, that some other films that you've done. Well, yeah, I've been pretty active over the years. I just finished a film called Under the Bed, which is based on a true story about a stalker that was discovered under this woman's bed in her house. Apparently, he stole her keys as a valet, posing as a valet, and moved into her house and lived under her bed for a few days. So I kind of wrote a script based on that, and that's on A&E.
And prior to that, I did a movie that I'm really proud of called The Objective, which steers a little bit more into sci-fi thriller for me. And it's a special forces CIA film that takes place in Afghanistan, about the CIA operative that recruits the special forces group to go find this odd anomaly that they have suspected is something kind of weird out in the desert, and then very strange things start to happen. So that we shot all that in Morocco. So that's called The Objective. Which so those are my two latest films that are cool and have done really well. The Objective has sort of got a whole cult following overseas, so it's been really popular. So yeah, those are the most two recent things I've done, outside of a bunch of little kind of small projects. And now I'm working on another one as we speak called Skyman, that you can check out on skymanthemovie.com, which is based on a story I came up with of a guy who's about to turn 40. He lives in Barstow, California. And as a kid, when he was around 10 years of age, he claims he was visited by an alien and out while camping in the desert with his father. And now he's about to turn 40, and he's been kind of obsessed with this vision he's had that he's going to reunite with this alien back out at the same place in the desert. So he's got this whole documentary mission. He's going out into the desert to reunite with this alien, and we're following him. And weird shit happens. So that's what I'm working on now.
Wow, that sounds awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited to have the chance to talk to you. It's been a complete pleasure. We want to thank you for coming on the show today, Dan.
It's a pleasure for me, guys.
So that'll wrap up episode 64 here for the Black Cat Shadow. Hope you guys enjoyed that in-depth interview with Daniel Myrick, and definitely, if you are a fan of the Blair Witch Project, you definitely got a lot of behind-the-scenes details there for sure. And so, yeah, this month, the theme for the month is witches. So later on this month, we are going to be talking about witchcraft, how it's portrayed in movies, and how that lines up with actual witches, actual practicing witches. So it'll be an interesting discussion. We're going to look at the history of witchcraft and maybe take a look at some of our favorite witch movies as well, and kind of take a look at what witches actually do and who they are. And as always, you can keep up with us on social media. We're on Facebook and Horror Amino, and we're also on Twitter at Black Cat Podcast. And you can go to our website at www.blackcatshadow.com, where you'll find all of our past episodes there that you can listen to, and also the links to download them on the app of your choice. And you also find our Black Cat Shadow movie store there, where you can buy a movie and help out the podcast. If you would like to send us an email with any comments or questions or concerns, you can do that at blackcatpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, thank you guys for listening to this episode, and we will see you on the next one. And remember to take a closer look at the world around you, and you may just find that it is stranger and more mysterious than you thought, especially in the Black Cat Shadow.